called The Christian Reconstructionists. And some of you who have had classes with me or have known me from other contexts have heard me talk about this project over the course of years. And so what I thought about doing tonight, I didn't really want to just talk about the Christian Reconstructionists, but the argument in the book is that this group is pretty obscure, and you have to know quite a bit about them to recognize their influence when it's all about out there, but it is all about out there. And the purpose of the book is to train you in hearing it when it's there, and to show you some particular places where it is. And so what I thought I would do tonight is different from what's in the book. I want to take some current discussions and show you where the Reconstructionist influence is, that you probably wouldn't have known if you hadn't heard of these folks. Just backtracking a little bit, one of the reasons this happened is because, I don't know how much you guys know about these folks, but they really do believe that the Bible speaks to every area of life, and they have articulated a theological system to apply it, and they think that it applies to all of us, not just to them. And so they use texts in the Old Testament that advocate stoning of gays and lesbians, and they believe in the death penalty for adultery, and a whole bunch of things like this. But what's happened over the years is that there have been folks that have followed the work of these people, and rightly were alarmed by these things that were said, but often when they're written about, you get this introductory paragraph that says, Christian Reconstructionists who advocate stoning, and they never go any further than that. And so other people hear that and they say, oh, they're just too far right to take seriously. But my argument is that while those things, thankfully, we don't need to take seriously, there's all kinds of other stuff that they've been doing for a really long time that is bearing fruit. And so that's some of what I want to talk about. Just a quick overview. The founder of this movement is Rus's John Rushdoony. He promoted this view that the Bible speaks to all areas of life and that it's binding upon all of us. He's much more influential than people realize. And I'm going to get a little technical with some philosophical, theological language, but just hang there with me, and it won't be long, and I promise to define it. But there's this notion of presuppositionalism that's crucially important to this whole system. Rushdoony argued that all knowledge is dependent upon presuppositions that are not testable or provable. And for him, you can either presuppose the God of the Bible and the authority of that God, or you can presuppose the supremacy of human reason. And every other system, every other religion, every other philosophical system, every other structure fits into that category of presupposing human reason. And in this system, there's no possibility of neutrality. It's one way or the other way. And so this is, I argue, this is part of how the religious right gets its profoundly uncompromising character. Because there's no neutral ground. Neutrality doesn't exist. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. They also take a view toward the Bible that is rather uncommon among contemporary Christians. It does date back to the Reformation. They didn't make it up. But they talk about the unity of Scripture. That is, they believe in the entirety of the Bible, including the Old Testament Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. They see them as complementary, not as one replacing the other, as so many contemporary Christians do. In fact, they see that contemporary view as heresy. And so they build a structure of biblical law, relying on Deuteronomy and Leviticus and all of those texts that you know well, I'm sure. The next category that's important for understanding them is this notion of sphere sovereignty. For Rushdoony and the Reconstructionists, God ordains authority to human beings in three distinct spheres: the family, the church, and the civil government. But all of those spheres are still under God. So they'll talk about believing in the separation of church and state, and they actually do believe in that. The family doesn't have the same tasks assigned to it under this authority that the church has or that the state has. But when they say separation of church and state, they don't mean what we mean by it, because they believe in a theocracy. So all of those spheres, while distinct from each other, are under God's authority. So, to talk about the implications of this going on in the news right now. Like my nice little collage? I went for like an hour on that, right? Okay, so in the debate last week, Bobby Jindal said that Christians were the most persecuted group in America. It was kind of shocking when he said it, actually. But it shouldn't have been. I mean, I know that they think this. And these are photographs from some of the cases. Obviously, the clerk from Kentucky, the cake bakers, the florist, photographers. These are people who are fundamentalist Christians who are opposed to marriage equality and who believe that involving themselves in the ritual and practice in any degree is a violation of their free exercise of religion. During our discussion section, if you want, we could talk a little bit about that. When the decision came down last year, there was a lot of kind of hand-wringing that, oh, pastors are going to be thrown in jail, and there's, and now that somebody actually was thrown in jail, the people who find this to be a violation of their free exercise of religion are feeling rather apocalyptic about it. But we can talk about how those issues sort out, because clearly what a clerk of the court does is different from what a florist does. And maybe even what a florist does, that is making a bouquet in the shop that goes out of the shop, might be different from what a photographer does who would go to a ceremony. And we have a long history of protecting religious practice and making accommodations for people to not be required to do things that violate their conscience within reason. And so it might be that we could talk a little bit about how those issues sort out, because they are distinct from each other. But the questions of Christians being persecuted in America seems a little bit crazy. Put some statistics there for you. Between 70 and 85% of Americans identify as Christians, depending on what survey you're looking at. We've never had a non-Christian president. Only 9 of 112 Supreme Court justices have been anything other than Christian. And now 6 out of the 9 are Catholic. Did you know there are no Protestants on the Supreme Court anymore? Isn't that interesting? And current Congress is 92% Christian, which is even higher than either estimate of how many Christians there are in the US. So to think about Christians being persecuted, it's kind of hard to get your head around what that might mean. But I want to step back from the literal aspects of it, the claims that are made, for just a minute, and talk about the function of the notion of martyrdom in Christianity. I'm sure you've all heard of Fox's Book of Martyrs. You're aware of the significant relevance of the martyrdom narratives in the development and identity of Christianity as a religious tradition. Jesus himself is envisioned as a martyr. There's a really interesting book that I actually, if you've not read it, I recommend it highly. It might be good for your book club, actually. Candida Moss has written a book called The Myth of Persecution. And she goes all the way back to the early church, and actually even before the early church. One of the arguments made in the early church was that Christianity was unique because people were willing to die for it. Well, as it turns out, there was a Jewish tradition that was very much like that predated the Christian tradition. It goes all the way back to the Greeks, maybe before. So she's got this very nice historical contextualization of the concept of martyrdom. And she shows how those stories that shaped Christianity as they did actually came years and years after the people that they were supposedly about had lived. Some of the martyrdom narratives talk about what the person who was killed was thinking when they were killed. We know they didn't write that, right? Somebody wrote after them. And you can see, when you read the book and see how that's worked through history, you can actually see how it works in current day and the construction of the martyrdom of a character around a person. It is so central to Christianity that if it didn't exist, they would have to invent it. Because it's the very mechanism by which these kind of Christians understand, it's how they weigh, that's how they decide that they're on the right side of history, right? The world is divided into good guys and bad guys. And the good guys are going to be persecuted. So the persecution narrative actually legitimates their sense about what they're doing. So it is really important to the identity of this kind of Christian. So it's not surprising to see these conflicts playing out in this way. Next, I want to talk just a little bit about the process of manufacturing this focus on martyrs and the concern that Christians, I want to look at the production of the narrative in which Christianity becomes this most persecuted of peoples in the U.S. This is a conference coming up. Okay. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to read you some of what it says anyway. While I was preparing this talk last week, I stumbled upon this, and it's actually rather interesting. This is in Iowa. We all know what that means. It's scheduled for this coming November, so it's a month and a half from now. This is what they ask over on this side over here. These are serious questions. Are you ready for this? Are you ready to be arrested? Are you ready to lose your children to the state? Is your pastor ready to go to jail for refusing to officiate a same-sex marriage? Will your church be shut down? Will Christians be forced to break the law? Take heart. Over on this side. Yay. God is preserving islands of freedom. Get encouraged, get equipped, get your community of support in place. Get the strategies that are working. Fortify the local jurisdiction, city and county, while preparing for federal persecution. Really intense rhetoric. Really intense rhetoric. So you want to think about where did that come from? Wow. Okay, so if you talking just a little bit about this background in Christian Reconstructionism and where I think that kind of framework and where I think that kind of narrative originated in a sort of, not originated in an original sense, but in contemporary American conservative religion and politics. Presuppositionalism and the myth of neutrality lead to the conviction that there are these only two ways of seeing things and there can't be any neutrality. So there's no space for the state to take a neutral role with regard to adjudicating claims of civil rights by same-sex couples who want to be married, or claims of religious freedom by fundamentalist Christians. In the way that they're looking at it, there is no way for a middle ground. It's just not possible. So, and I think that's so hard for us to get our brains around because we think there's got to be a compromise. There's just got to be a compromise, When in the case in Kentucky, the conflict was apparently over the fact that her name appeared, King Davis's name appeared on the marriage license, and so if she could just have her name removed from it, it would be okay. Well, it wouldn't have been okay because they were standing on an absolute principle. The principle is opposition to same-sex marriage. So even if a compromise had been worked out on that point, these kinds of cases of civil disobedience, that's what that was. These kinds of cases of civil disobedience over same-sex marriage, I think those are going to persist. They're going to increase. They're going to become much more heated. And I think organizations like the one promoting that conference are setting it up to be exactly that. It might be interesting to know, well, let me save that. We'll get to that in a little bit because we don't know who that group is quite yet. Theonomy is just the idea that God's law still applies, and the application of biblical law from the Hebrew Bible. And incidentally, I don't know how many of you have had any background in biblical study, but there are a few texts that people suggest perhaps reference homosexuality. It's probably, scholars think that it doesn't have anything to do with what we know of as homosexuality today at all. There's way fewer about those than there are things like adultery. So it's not that the Bible says this about homosexuality, it's that their reading of the Bible says this. And there are lots of other readings that are at least as plausible. But the fundamental thing is that this Christian Reconstructionist worldview is ultimately, fundamentally incompatible with any other one. So this is, in 1963, this is when Rushdoony started writing. In 1963, Rushdoony wrote in this book, The Nature of the American System, he wrote about the developments that we're seeing now. He framed this particular way of looking at the conflict between what is claimed to be First Amendment religious rights, protected rights, and the increasing secularization of society. So in 1963, he wrote this. The chapter was called The Attack on Religious Liberty. He said, first, the state is secularized in the name of freedom, and second, every prerogative of the church is attacked. And he goes on to elaborate about this. In his instance, it started with taxation. He was very concerned about that. So he wrote, anticipated the revocation of tax exemption beginning with requiring pastors to fill out papers, arguing that they are entitled to a tax exemption. Not sure if you've heard this yet, but just about 2 days ago, the case in which, so you remember the Hobby Lobby case, some organizations claim to be religious and the free exercise right against the Affordable Care Act requirement that they provide contraceptive coverage in a health insurance plan. One of the end runs that the court had used to, that the administration had used to accommodate religious rights or religious freedom protections. One of the end runs was to say if an organization filed an affidavit claiming that it violated their religious freedom, that the insurance company would provide the coverage, and that the company wouldn't have to buy coverage, including contraceptive coverage. But there were several organizations, including Wheaton College, a Christian college, but 3 or 4 filed lawsuits saying that actually just filling out the form was a violation of their religious freedom. For the most part, the circuit courts have disagreed with that claim, but just 2 days ago, one of the district courts said that, sided with them and said that that is indeed an infringement on religious freedom, setting that up to be the case before the Supreme Court, probably this term, because that's what they like to rule on when the lower level courts have disagreed, and it has national implications. Those are the kinds of cases that the Supreme Court takes. So that just happened, this concern over the filing of papers is part. You see, there's no neutrality. There's no space for any kind of compromise or accommodation. In Rushdoony's case, it tied directly to the removal of public prayer from the classrooms. And he said that removal of public prayer from the classrooms would lead immediately to the sanctioning of homosexuality. So when they look back at history, they see that, in their view, that Rushdoony predicted that those two things would, that one would cause the other. Rushdoony was the primary founder of this movement. There was a kind of secondary level of writers. And the most important of those is Gary North. Some of you may have heard of him. He kind of made a name for himself or some such thing. I don't know, made a fool of himself maybe with the whole Y2K thing. So because he's a bit apocalyptic, and so he has a lot of interest in survivalist stuff and all of that. So he was sure that Y2K was going to bring about the end of Western civilization as we know it. So in 1982 and 89, in these 2 books here, he wrote, "So let us be blunt about it. We must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know that there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, no neutral civil government. Then people trained in the Christian schools will get busy constructing a Bible-based social, political, and religious order which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God." One of the recurrent themes in the work of Christian Reconstructionists is hearkening back to how they understand the origins of Christendom in the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. So in their view, civilization was in a state of disarray, and when institutions started to crumble, there were Christians around who were trained and skilled to sort of pick up the pieces and take dominion, as they say, take dominion and establish Christianity as the ruling faith of the Holy Roman Empire. And because that's how they think this will happen, every time it seems like there's a cataclysm, they're a little bit happy, because that's going to create this crumbling of society into which they will be able to ride on their white horses and fix everything according to biblical law. And that's what they think is happening now. So, getting back to this conference just a little bit, I want to play you a little, is that available? Can you do that? There's a trailer for the conference advertising it, and it really exemplifies the way in which these folks promote this, and so I want to play it and then talk to you just a little bit about it.
Joining us now, authors of Whatever the Cost.
Thanks for having me.
Some would say you suffered a great loss, really, for sticking by your beliefs. Worth it in the end?
Oh, absolutely.
5 Revolutionary Guards came and attacked the house he was staying at with his parents. And in the midnight, I get a call from his mom saying, "They've taken my son. I don't know where they've taken him."
In the context of a prayer service the night before the Democratic National Convention in 2012, we called the church to repentance. We prayed and asked God to forgive our nation and ourselves for the sins that are in our nation. In that context, Right Wing Watch wrote an article and really created a narrative that made Jason and I out to be hate-filled bigot and extremists.
As you're probably aware, the Supreme Court came down with a decision on same-sex marriage. And unfortunately, it's the decision that we expected and that we predicted. But as we said earlier, we had a plan. That plan is still in place.
We experienced that your will be done moment. You know what? We are not going to deny our faith. And if our faith costs us a reality show, so be it.
When I had no money, single mom, didn't know what the future held, didn't know anything, the Lord has put me before government officials, before ambassadors, as I got to share that Jesus is the solution to the problem they're looking for.
I encourage you, encourage other people. This is not the end. This is the very beginning of the battle for religious freedom, and it's a battle that we can win.
So I want to think just a little bit, first of all, about the presentation values there, right? What did you think of the music? It's calibrated to create a sense of emotional alarm, isn't it? But interestingly, do you know anything about the stories of the two brothers or the woman who was talking? The two brothers did one of those HGTV home decorator shows. Clearly none of you have seen them, so it was not a particularly successful one. But they, maybe 2 years ago now, made some rather hostile comments about LGBT people, and I can't actually remember what they said. But there was a bit of an uproar, and HGTV withdrew the sponsorship of the program. And so they are constructing themselves. Their show wasn't that successful. And now they are building a whole little following in this world by setting themselves up as martyrs, martyrs defending religious freedom. The woman you saw speaking, she is the wife of a pastor who is held incarcerated in Iran. A real battle over religious freedom, probably. And the way in which they encapsulated, the way in which they brought those two stories together led this gravitas to the stories about the guys in that reality TV show. Right? You know, prison in Iran is not losing a reality TV show. It's just not the same. But interestingly, neither one of those examples was particularly well known. Neither was, when you watched that, you certainly didn't get the sense that this is in any way related to these kind of crazy, insidious people that I'm talking about, right? But, and then we can move to discussion here, but every single one of these are their speakers who are their pastors, theologians, philosophers, and historians. Well, that guy, Bill Potter, is not actually a historian. He's more like David Barton. But every single one of those men is a Christian Reconstructionist. The second one, Dr. Joel McDermott, this one right here, he is Gary North's son-in-law, and he's married to Rushdoony's granddaughter. But every single, Reconstructionists are funny because obviously most people don't want to be identified with them. So there are a lot of people who have the same kinds of views, who travel in the same circles, who never differentiate themselves at all, but insist that they are not Christian Reconstructionists. And then there's another tier of people who are shaped by Christian Reconstructionists and may actually not even recognize the way in which that's true. The influences are subtle, and I often compare that to the way in which most Christians don't have a clue how much Augustine shaped what they believe to be true, right? Or how, let alone Augustine, okay? Augustine, at least we know that name, right? Think of all of the people that impacted early Christianity philosophically and theologically, whose names we don't even remember. So people often don't have a quick facility with, and even those of us who get the luxury of spending our lives studying don't know the people who influenced us, right? So it's not a cut on them that they don't understand this. But the truth is, the fact that someone doesn't know they've been influenced by this movement doesn't mean that they haven't been influenced by this movement. Rushdoony laid the legal groundwork for the autonomy of Christian schools and Christian homeschooling from state regulation. So every family that homeschools isn't Reconstructionist, but they are all impacted by Christian Reconstruction, many of them in ways that they actually don't even understand. Because we have almost complete legal autonomy for homeschooling in most states in the U.S. That's directly as a result of Rushdoony and the work that he did. But these folks aren't in these several tiers down of influence. These are the people who work at explicitly Reconstructionist organizations. These are the people that publish Reconstructionist books. They go to Reconstructionist conferences and present to other Christian Reconstructionists. But they're also the entire panel for this conference in Iowa that's supposed to be kicking off this battle to defend religious liberty, just months before the Iowa caucuses and the presidential election. I'm sure that you all saw the news with Mike Huckabee up in Kentucky, standing right by Kim Davis, and you can believe that he will be here too. So this is kind of the subtle way in which their influence is broader than people recognize. And with that, I think I'll stop there and invite you to ask questions or make arguments or conversation or critiques or whatever it is that, yes.